Hi there. I'm Claudia Hosky from Fed Insider. And on behalf of TD Cynics and Checkmarx, I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on how to fight threats to the software supply chain. Please type your questions and comments into the Q&A pod. If we don't get to them during today's webinar, we'll share them with our speakers so they can follow up with you. Also, take note of the Resources tab on the left side of your screen to download today's slides and other reading materials on the topic. We offer live captioning for all of our webinars. To follow along with us today, use the hyperlink under the Live Captioning or CART tab located above the slides, and we'll have the full transcript available in the next day or two. And finally, to earn a training certificate for today's webinar, you'll need to answer all polling questions and stay for the duration of the discussion. And now, let me turn over the reins to today's moderator, Jane Norris from Fed Insider, to kick off the conversation. Take it away, Jane.
Thanks so much, Claudia. It's great to see all of you today. Thanks very much for being here. This is going to be a great panel, fantastic topic. So let me get right to it. After several high-profile cyber incidents resulting from exploited vulnerabilities, the Office of Management and Budget released Memorandum M2209. That was in 2022. It requires agencies to adopt the federal zero trust architecture, which has 5 pillars: identity, devices, network data, applications, and workloads. Today, we'll discuss a key area of focus, which is application security. Now, 2 elements of modern software are growing in importance and risk for application security teams: open source code and APIs. A recent report found that 41% of AppSec managers named open source software supply chain attacks as their top cause of breaches and ongoing threats. As for APIs and the connecting role they play, that also makes them a fast-growing target for bad actors. So today, our esteemed panel, and I mean seriously very heavyweight folks, check out their bios, by the way, on the top of your screen. So our panel from government and industry discuss the threats posed to the software supply chain and the measures that are being taken to better defend against attacks. So let me introduce you to our speakers and we'll start our conversation. First, let me introduce Jerry Cochran. Jerry is Deputy Chief Information Officer and Director of the Cybersecurity and Digital Ops Division of the Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. Jerry, thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Nate Fontaine is Deputy Chief Information Security Officer at Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Nate, welcome. Thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm excited to be here. Thank you very much.
Good. I am too. I appreciate that. I'm excited to have all of you. Sean Kingsbury is with us as well, VP of Cyber at SAIC. Hi, Sean.
Hey, how's it going?
Good to see you. J.R. Williamson is also with us, Senior VP and CISO Corporate Information Security at Leidos. Hi, J.R.
Hey, great to be here. Thanks, Jane.
It's a pleasure to have you. And then finally, Peter Chestnut, CISO of North American Checkmarx. Hi, Peter.
Hi there. Looking forward to the conversation today.
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. Ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, you can direct them to our team today, our speakers. You'll find the link to do so at the top of your screen, and we will do our best to get your questions answered. Hopefully in the course of the conversation we can. So here we go. Let me start with you, Jerry. If you could give us a level set. This issue is a very big one for agencies, as everyone is really responsible for this. So can you give us a brief overview of the main aspects and requirements of the application pillar of the Zero Trust architecture in the OMB memo?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, the memo is pretty extensive. Like you said, it covers 5 pillars, but it's also intended to be outcome-based. So by design, it isn't super prescriptive, but rather points to standards and best practices and principles, standards like the NIST 800-207 Zero Trust kind of standard or guidance. Specifically for the applications and workload pillar of Zero Trust, the memo kind of prescribes 6 actions or outcomes that they want to see agencies achieve. The first of those is what they call application security testing programs. That can take on, again, that's not very prescriptive. That can take on a lot of flavors, but they effectively want to see progress in, hey, what are you doing to ensure your applications are security tested? What kind of techniques, tools are you employing? What practices are you employing in-house to make sure your applications are secure? Second, are you getting outside sets of eyes? So are you using third-party evaluation of your applications? Are you having them test or pen test or evaluate? Third, do you have a vulnerabilities disclosure program? So if you have an external facing application or website, do you have a ready place for folks to go if they find, or researchers find vulnerabilities in your applications or website? And then another aspect is, do you have you must choose at least one internet-facing public agency application that you expose to the internet and to the public. And are that's also a test. Can you actually provide internet-facing application to the public as an agency that's secure? There's also requirements for application information and inventories and reporting of non.gov domains to the Department of Homeland Security or CISA. And then their final aspect is this notion of, or it's kind of a goal or a North Star of what they call immutable workload. So really the embodiment of DevSecOps and the idea that you have fully automated development rollout, a continuous integration, continuous delivery application development model, and that you have some of those mature processes for software development and delivery in your agency.
And so, can you tell us how far along you believe most of government to be in this process?
Well, again, I think that it varies by agency. What happens at the White House and OMB then filters down to each agency and each agency element. I am part of the Department of Energy, and that has to flow down through headquarters, through the department elements like the Office of Science or National Nuclear Security, and then to their sites and individual entities. And throughout that process, there is a negotiation. Because these are outcome-based and not prescriptive, at the agency level, they can say, this is what we mean by an application security program or testing program. And so most of the entities or government agencies are working through that process to be compliant with these OMB memos, which honestly came out of the May 2022 or 2021 executive order on cybersecurity and zero trust. The OMB memo is really just an embodiment of that says, hey, you got to do this, right? So I think agencies are in that process. I think different agencies are more mature than others. It's also a resourcing problem. It's like, I can do this, but how much does it cost? And is the funding available, or is this just a White House unfunded mandate, right? So those are always the things you have to work out when these things come down.
Right. Thank you very much. That's a great overview. Really appreciate it. Nate, let's go to you next. You're the CISO at ICE. Can you talk about the threats and open source dependencies that you are reviewing, and how you work to keep your systems up to date and free of vulnerabilities?
Sure. So it's a great question, right? As the mission need and the increased speed to delivery for every organization continues, open source technologies have a huge benefit as far as cost, right? Overall cost and initial investment. But as we all become aware a few years ago, there are issues with supply chain. Even large corporations who had insight into the network activity of most of the large enterprises across the world had a supply chain issue where they had code ingested into their systems and delivered out as their end product. So the biggest concern that we have coming in is obviously the supply chain portion. Do we have the significant investment to be able to ensure that those open source libraries are protected? If a company like SolarWinds can be impacted by changes in their software packages, it can absolutely happen to GitHub libraries where a developer is creating a solution, pulling it down for expediency's sake, working to develop the solution, and next thing you know, they don't fully understand everything that's in that library that they've pulled in from GitHub, and now there's backdoors or other vulnerabilities built into the system, or what other extras, for lack of a better term, have been built in by accident. Open source and other partners that rely on them, there are other issues as far as delayed vulnerability remediation and discovery. These don't have large corporate enterprises behind them looking for vulnerabilities, looking to patch, looking to remediate these vulnerabilities. And you also run a risk of if something large like a log4j vulnerability that's embedded at the base level of some of these packages that are being delivered, is the open source project going to be able to continue, or will it be abandoned because it's too difficult for them to fix it and they don't want to move on? So now you have a solution that you have in-house that you may depend on. Hopefully not for critical infrastructure, but you have a reliance on a solution that's no longer supported, right? It's been abandoned. How fast do they get patched? Can your organization actually withstand the risk of whatever vulnerability has been disclosed for an extended amount of time while the community and the open source developers wrap their heads around it and get it fixed and patched? For ourselves, a lot of the information intelligence we get is following closely with CISA and DHS for a lot of the vulnerability disclosures. Jerry, you mentioned a few moments ago about having a vulnerability disclosure program. DHS has got one here. We have one at ICE where we welcome folks to come in, identify vulnerabilities, and help us out. Make sure if they see something that we've not caught with our active, red and blue teams, purple teams, and also pen tests from high value asset assessments and others. If someone else sees something, there is a path to report those vulnerabilities in. For items that are larger, Jerry, I think you also mentioned asking the providers and the partners to do third-party assessments. For us, that FedRAMP environment has been really helpful in forcing that, because a lot of times in discussions, you'll ask for these, and the vendor partner, if it wasn't originally in your contract language, you may end up with, yes, we say it's secure, but it's always helpful to have that third-party view to look at it and give you some assurances of what's already there. We also Go ahead.
I wanted to ask that, is that changed the mindset really of the way you view your systems? Having, vulnerability testing by an outside third party or interested third party, is that something that has required some getting used to, if you will?
It has, and that's where, so yes, I mean, obviously in the government, it used to have these big castle walls and we used to do everything ourselves and we didn't trust anybody to look at things. The government as a whole has now realized that there is more intelligence and more benefit from opening that relationship and opening those processes to trusted external partners who you have some assurance that they're able to deliver, quality results and quality impacts on what's going on.
Right.
So one of the things I wanted to bring up here is thinking about your program, and it's interesting to think about that side of the supply chain of there's a vulnerability exposed, it needs to get patched, and the application needs to get patched. There is onus on the agency to think about when the baton gets passed to them. So how am I consuming this software? Is it a SaaS, software as a service, or is it something that I am actually deploying inside, understanding what it's going to take me to do that changeover, because that part of that process does impact how long you have to live with that vulnerability. Even if the vendor was able to hand you a patch immediately, if it takes you a month to test and roll it out, then that's the minimum amount of time that you're going to have to live with that.
No,
So
and Peter, I think you're exactly right there. And a lot of the stuff is the government's also, as we've gone outside of those castle walls, right? We've now had to start trusting other people to be service providers, especially in those SaaS opportunities or infrastructure as a service capabilities, that they're able to deploy these on our behalf. And also, what is the relationship? You can't just flat out say that DHS 4300A, right, our guiding principles in DHS for IT security, you must follow all these, because these large providers, in some cases, for example, Microsoft in their environment, they have SLAs that they're going to manage towards, that they handle everybody, right? How do you get your specific requirements into those large organizations?
That's a good question for you, Peter, and it leads me into your question. So what are some of the best practices and tools for securing the software supply chain?
Well, first of all, it's understanding what you have. So there have been previous mandates around software bill of materials. The question is, what do we do with it when we get it? Do we take it and throw it on the shelf? Are we managing to it? Are we understanding what's in there and looking at it? Because all of the vulnerabilities that may be in there may not be remediated. There is, hey, here's what I use, and here are the open vulnerabilities against it. Does that match with our risk tolerance? And once those things get there, they're stale. That software supply chain and the software that's in that bill of materials changes constantly. Are we monitoring it? So there is onus on the consumer as well as the producer. As producer, I have to give you that bill of materials, but then you have to do something appropriate with it. So the way I think about this is, again, even that understanding of how long would it take me to deploy a change, that's all part of the application security program, is that entire life cycle of how do I get it from the vendor into the environments that I use it. And then what do I do with it after that from a maintenance point of view? Am I understanding what's in there? When I see a CVE, I should know, based on those bill of materials, if I'm impacted. And if I am, then I'm either reaching out to that vendor or I'm expecting through SLA or SLO that they're going to contact me in that time. But I'm in the middle of an incident at that point, and I want to make sure that I have that understanding.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Nate and Peter. Appreciate those great responses. So, Sean, let's go to you next. What are agencies doing and how are they progressing in meeting the guidelines of OMB Memo M2209 in application security and testing and scanning? I'm sure there are a lot of different places on the journey that you deal with in your role, but can you give us an overview?
Well, first off, the conversation that's taken place thus far kind of summarizes some of that too, right? When you look at conversation that Nate just had and also Jerry and Peter, the conversation has shifted, right? That's the first thing, right? It's not about looking at technology as mops and brooms. Now the conversation from a cultural change in the government is, I need to better understand what this means from a cyber perspective. What is the impact to the services I have to deliver? So first off, when you say how are agencies actually aligning with this, first off, I see a change in culture. And that's important because that's the beginning of change. Now, in various conversations, you have to remember, technology drives business, while business enables technology to meet its goals and objectives. So through that lens, what I've actually started to see is policy being looked at as an enabler to deliver the mission of the government. And there's this goal of having zero trust is a strategy. It's not a thing. And when you look at what that means, the various agencies that I've had conversations with, they have at least the first cut of what that zero trust strategy is supposed to look like. It's due by the end of 2024. But the other thing I'm seeing is opportunities are being let with requirements baked in for zero trust alignment, like the Department of Treasury as an example, right? It's implementing the T cloud that has to meet zero trust compliant requirements and when you look at what that means, that's directly connected to FedRAMP, especially Rev 5, where it specifically calls out secure supply chain as a part of the implementation of it. So it's what I'm seeing is a movement, a positive progression of government agencies understanding, one, how to have a strategy in play, understanding that zero trust was cloud when cloud first came out, right? When cloud first came out, everybody said cloud was cloudy because everybody said it was cloud. Now the conversation is, hey, zero trust is that new word, but in essence, it's turning into a real definition. And that definition is resulting in outcomes and how services are being delivered. Like when you look at Executive Order 14028, it specifically says, hey, it's not just about adding cyber on the back end, it's IT modernization, cyber by design. So it's saying build secure, resilient solutions, increase the cybersecurity posture of the government, look at cybersecurity as national security, and use zero trust as that foundation. So when you look at it through that lens, government's getting it. So they're releasing opportunities with requirements that enable these outcomes, meaning releasing requirements that have an expectation and holding the vendor community accountable to meet this new level requirements. FAR is being modified to further add those requirements in. And we're starting to see incremental solutions as new applications are actually being released with these expectations of secure supply chain, DevSecOps, and you start to look at other services that are actually being leveraged that enable, open source vulnerability scanning and the likes, and policy-based management throughout the pipeline, as Jerry was mentioning. But it's happening now, and I'm excited just to see this positive progression, focus on cyber, and it's not looking at technology and cyber in two buckets. Now it's building resilient solutions that are policy-based, that actually turn into active protection throughout the life cycle.
Yeah, that's very good observation. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because it does seem like it is unifying, baking the cake, if you will. Instead of the bolt-ons, we are getting built-ins, and that you come up, as a native, as a native security issue. So I think that's a big improvement. Thank you very much, Sean. And I want to go to JR here. How you do a lot of work with clients, obviously, in your role as VP at CISO in the Corporate Information Security Division. So what can you tell us about, attacks like the malicious denial of service attacks, brute force attacks, data exfiltration? How do you help clients monitor and protect against things like that?
And APIs. I mean,
APIs.
and first of all, I'd just say that, after spending years working on hardening our networks and our endpoints, making a little bit of progress there, bad guys start attacking applications and application servers, and that became sort of a thing. And then after spending time really implementing more capabilities like continuous monitoring and assessment, at active penetration testing to verify our applications are okay, now APIs show up. And APIs right now are, quite frankly, the real weak spot in our whole access management architecture layer. I mean, they've essentially become the screen door in our submarine. And unfortunately, the bad guys are actively exploiting it. Everything from, just sort of weak API configurations, because we're just trying to connect two systems, right? What's the problem with doing that? And really not putting the right provisions around those configurations. We're now seeing, of course, people, the bad guys are sort of stealing credentials that are used because these APIs generally have privilege, and they're grabbing a hold of those credentials. There's no MFA, no multi-factor authentication involved in these type of use cases because they're non-human accesses, and they're stealing those and they're flying under the radar screen. So just like we've seen in some, very visible breaches last year and this year, these APIs are absolutely being exploited. So this is a real big concern for all of us. And of course, DDoS, as you mentioned, I mean, DDoS continues to be a thing. There was a massive surge in distributed denial of service attacks in 22, and definitely for the first half of 2023. Some of that we're seeing just sort of a bleed over from all of the activity happening in Eastern Europe right now, particularly targeted against U.S. companies who are involved in the defense industrial base, who are providing services and support, and sometimes weapon systems, as you know, in support of Ukraine. And so we're tending to get quite a bit of attention from some of these folks. And I think we'd also say that, the DDoS tool set and techniques is no longer really sort of the tool for just hacktivists. We are definitely seeing nation state actors starting to use these techniques to further disrupt operations. And when you think about the level of sophistication that's changed, it used to be one of those things where, you might get attacked for 30 minutes. Or a short period of time. Now we're seeing the ability of using both the technology that's out there and shifting from just the sort of traditional flooding of your network layers into more web application attacks and getting up into the application layer, which is much more difficult to deal with and something that you can persist over a longer duration. So DDoS is definitely becoming a thing. And as we all know, stealing credentials is a fantastic way of being able to access data that you shouldn't have access to, but be able to do it in a way of flying under the radar screen. Since most people are just looking for policies of, hey, when did a authorization request fail? versus what are successful authentication that occur that, quite frankly, should never have occurred. And loss of data just continues to be a thing. And although zero trust is not a new concept, as you've already heard so far in the conversation today, and actually not even a word I like very much. I mean, we're all about collaborating and getting stuff done. It's kind of hard to do that with zero trust. I'm more of a fan of earned trust or managed trust, where we build up, we establish trust so that we can actually do things in a safe way. But the focus on zero trust is really first and foremost, as Nate said, kind of on the policies and the key sort of principles of how we design computing architectures and solutions. So it doesn't in itself have to be about the technology, but ultimately the technology is used to implement those policies and processes that we agree. And so how do we do it? We built this thing, we call it the Zero Trust Readiness Level Assessment, and we assess our customers under contracts on our programs. It's aligned to the NIST Zero Trust Framework, as you would expect. And what it essentially does is goes off and evaluates, both operational policies and capability maturity across that 7 sort of critical areas. Things like user and identity, device and endpoint, network and environment. Application and workloads, data, of course, visibility analytics, and automation and orchestration. And so this assessment goes through, evaluates that, gives a scoring and a ranking based on that established criteria under the guidance that NIST provides in their special publication 800-207, and then creates sort of a journey map, for the customer to say that, look, here's an area where your maturity may have been a 4 out of 9. And here are some of the things you could do to improve your maturity over time, either by improving policy or improving enforcement of that policy.
That's great. I mean, this is a great assessment of sort of where we are in the process. So I really appreciate any comments from the other participants, or because we're going to move on to acquisition.
Yeah, I have one comment, Jane, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so along with what he just mentioned through, there's also a question, I think, in the chat box about how does AI impact software supply chain? Going back to the SolarWinds example, that really was only determined and identified because of abnormal behavior, right? So AI, understanding what APIs, like we just talked about a few moments ago, what they're supposed to be doing, what they're supposed to be able to be requested to provide, but also what is being sent back. So you do have some instances where the cyber hygiene is not built around the actual request. If I'm supposed to be able to request a name and an address and that's it, am I able to now request a name, address, social security number, and additional information, and I get a positive response back, from the system, because it's not configured to just limit the responses they get back. But the AI models are going to be really important to ensure that we're getting what is a known behavior, entity behavior for both users, but as well as for the runtimes and the applications and the connections through APIs that we're getting. Are they being seen as normal? How do we teach the machine language, to understand what normal looks like? And then how does it automate alerts back to your security operations center or others based off that abnormal behavior?
Yeah, Nate, I would just add, I think you're spot on. And I'd say we've generally done a pretty decent job of the hybrid use cases, so on-prem into your cloud service, of implementing an API gateway so that you can both understand over time what those normal behaviors are, and then, of course, detect those abnormal behaviors. The real challenge we have is SaaS to SaaS. Because you don't sit generally in between SaaS to SaaS. So just like we had to invent a new technology 15 years ago that we call today CASB, we need sort of a CASB for API security, because we need a way to sit in between all those SaaS to SaaS calls and to inspect those conversations, both to get that understanding, as you mentioned, of behavior, but also to detect when something very inappropriate is happening.
Great conversation and great insights. So thank you all. And I do want to get into the conversation as it relates to acquisition standards, because we all know that that's where it all begins, the relationship between the contractor and the customer. And, if the acquisition is limited in some way or not fully robust, you may not get the result that you're looking for. So I'm going to start with you, Jerry, and ask you to give us your thoughts about the acquisition process and how it can be improved to incorporate supply chain security, planning in this planning, solicitation, evaluation, and oversight stages?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, there has been some work underway. I think, if you we've already mentioned that, federal acquisition, defense federal acquisition, so the FAR and DFAR, there is work underway to kind of improve some of the acquisition standards at the federal level. And really, this is about the federal government saying we're using our massive purchase power to incent our vendor population to develop more secure products, right? And so that's partly what this is. But in terms of, you have to take a whole of life cycle approach when you look at acquisition standards or contractual language or elements that you want to add. And so it starts with, building in contractual language that, it can't be too prescriptive because you can't choose tools or choose practices or choose development methodologies for vendors, but you have to be outcome based. And so you have to look across the software development lifecycle in the case of software and say, what are you doing at the very front end from a design and perspective? Are you training your developers to do secure coding? Are you educating them on how to do, the problems with API security? Are you doing attack surface analysis of your applications and just designing risk out from the beginning? And then as you're doing that, do your developers know actually how to securely code? And as you're checking in new code, are you testing it? Are you using automated testing to look for vulnerabilities and look at problems in the software? Are you using various techniques? Are you using various tools and practices? And all the way through that software release and maintenance and support lifecycle, it's how can you add contractual elements or acquisition elements that say, we need you to either attest or prove that you're using or prove that you're using these practices and standards throughout your development lifecycle. And there's a lot of opportunity to do that still. I think it's a lot about any organization can use the power of their procurement to influence their vendors to do better. And I think that's what the really kind of the paradigm shift in the government is, recognizing that we have to hopefully, if you believe in the market-based approach, hopefully you can incent vendors to do this so you don't have to regulate them to do this. But that's really what the acquisitions requirements are centered on is, hey, we're going to use the power of our giant purse, and we're going to build in some mechanisms throughout the development lifecycle that we need to know that you're doing so we have a confidence in the final product that it's more secure. So.
I think one of the interesting things that's happened in this community, especially with that need to now disclose the bill of materials, this is the first evidence-based, detailed accounting of what vendors are delivering to their consumers. And before it was attestation, tell me that you're doing it and, give me enough proof that says that you are. This is the first case, and I believe there will be others where we're saying, no, I need to see all of the ingredients because that's going to tell me a lot, and that's how I can manage it moving forward, where that wasn't the case if you look, back even a couple years ago. So I think this is a great way where the government is leading the way in what demonstration of application security could and should mean.
Well, I think there's an opportunity. I think there's an opportunity, though. I think Jerry hit the key point where he said opportunity for contracting to start to begin to have baseline language that turns into requirements. So every department, every agency isn't kind of, adding these requirements differently, right? When we want to get a consistent outcome across the government, right? So it turns into, I'm going to say, some opportunities from GSA and the likes to start to have standard wordology in these RFPs. So now, and then we can continue to build onto it and mature it as we start to see that we're getting the outcomes we expect. Because if you have the right verbiage in, you have the right accountability in there, and then you have vendors bidding toward in a consistent fashion and can continue to get that muscle memory in play to continue to respond. And as things change, the verbiage changes, but then as the vendor industry community continues to bid, it gets better, right? I mean, but if you don't do it at the acquisition level, I think there's going to be a big gap where you're going to get inconsistent outcomes of what you expect to get.
These are great points. And Nate, I want to bring you in as the CISO from ICE. You've been through obviously the acquisition process probably many times. What do you see as the way that the contracting community can maybe do a better job, and also the government do a job, better job at working with the contracting community and the private sector?
Absolutely. So I think Sean, hit it right there on the head that while agencies need to spend time creating standardized contract language that includes requirements like SBOMs, that includes requirements out there as far as maybe you get attestations or evidence from them prior to actual procuring the solution. Maybe you get tools like Checkmarx or others. You get reports from reviewing the application code itself to ensure you're getting quality products and quality code that you're looking for. But it definitely, for the government side, it's got to start with some standard clear language. And I think, Sean, you were right. It's got to start at a department level or higher, because if each one of the 13 agencies inside DHS does it differently, then it becomes difficult for the vendor community to be able to respond back, because each request is different. So there should be some definite similarities, at least at a department level, of what's being looked at. SBOMs are going to become critical as we go through this. It'll be interesting to see how some of the large vendors and contract partners decide to support SBOMs. But you've also got to get in the vendor community. I think, as a government, we're pretty open about what our requirements are. The requirements and the baselines are coming from NIST. They're coming from, these guidance are out there for public consumption. So it's not a mystery of what the government's looking for. It's just, can the government emphasize it enough in a procurement process to incentivize the contract community to deliver on what we're looking for, right?
Have you found certain tools that you have been able to employ to sort of help that exchange along? Do you think it's changing?
It is definitely changing. Obviously, SBOMs and being able to ingest third-party SBOMs from external sources is an area that's still growing. And to be able to ingest that outside SBOM, but also incorporate it into the SBOMs you already have for your internally developed applications. So you've got a common window pane or common looking glass to see across your applications. But there are a few tools that are out there that can help in giving you that comfort level in what you're actually asking for is what is being delivered. Do you do secure code development? As an agency, we're still maturing in that space. I would love to start seeing if we can actually start requesting evidence as part of the package, and that's one of the evaluation criteria as we go through procurements. We're not quite there yet, but I think the government as a whole is definitely heading in a direction like that.
Where it's Nate, I think well, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was gonna say, where it's no longer just here's the widgets and the buttons and processes I need you to do. It's now transitioning into what does the back end look like? How secure are your processes following? But go ahead, JR.
Yeah, I was just going to say, appreciate your remarks there. I mean, as a provider of software, creating the SBOM is really not a hard thing to do. And to your other comments, there are tools that are out there that are available. We can generate these things without too much difficulty. I think the real question is, what are we going to do with it? And first of all, how do we keep it current? Because software changes very quickly. So how do we maintain it? And then what are we really going to do with it? I mean, we're going to create this ginormous database of all of these SBOMs, and then what? So at the end of the day, the values comes from our use of the data. So it's not about just collecting the data, it's about using the data and understanding where the real risk factors are that could be exposed or expressed in the SBOM itself becomes the real value side of this. And I think that's an area of maturity we, of course, have not quite fully figured out. Across this ecosystem, and really need to focus some quality energy around to make sure that the juice is worth the squeeze. But getting it, generating it, submitting it, not hard. Doing something with it, I think we still got a ways to go.
Yeah, I'm with you.
Monitoring, the monitoring of it too. All right, go ahead, Jay.
I just think it's we have a long ways to go with SBOMs. 20 years ago, we tried the equivalent, which was a global hash database of all software components that NIST would maintain, and it was a complete failure, right? And I think that we have a long way to go, and even I don't actually think for software vendors creating SBOMs is easy. I mean, it's easy one time, but the next minute your developer has just checked in a new feature in the code and you need to rerun it, right? And so the continuous integration, continuous delivery kind of model that everybody's moving to, you're literally developing and updating SBOMs multiple times a second, right, in a big software organization. And then to JR's point, is say you actually achieve the ability to create a valid SBOM, what do you do with it on the customer side? There aren't tools today. There's actually a healthy startup industry in Israel and other places that are trying to look at how do we actually turn SBOMs into machine readable formats so that we can actually measure. But we have a long ways to go. And so I think it's a little bit of a pipe dream, and I'm not convinced that it's going to pan out.
Excellent comments. And staying along these lines, Sean, I wanted to go to you next and find out if there are new tools and technologies, either, currently in process or maybe on the drawing board, that would help agencies manage and transition from where they are now to something that is more secure and application security, capability that gets implemented smoothly and successfully.
See, I was quiet on the last conversation because I was going to hit it here, right?
Okay, well, go for it.
It's all a setup, right? It was all a setup. But no, so first off, I think it's important to understand that there is massive opportunity now. When you look at I come from I'm put on my former CIO hat, right? Build a plan and work the plan. And that's kind of what's going on when you look at building a zero trust strategy, because your zero trust strategy, if done right, it's actually your IT modernization strategy, but it's based on a foundation of resilience. So it's actually connecting all of the dots, right? When you look at the pillars of zero trust actually make up all of the components that make up your IT infrastructure. And then that also gets into services, and then that drives outcomes. But it's connecting connects the dots between from a security perspective that ensures what are all of the services that's required for you to deliver securely and meet the requirements of the business. Now, with that said, I come back to, first off, how do you get there? Baby steps. You can't do any of this overnight, and you can't do any of this all in year one, what have you. This is a multi-year strategy of what it means to actually implement it. But when you look at what this means and you break it out into individual pieces and prioritizing it, like when we say zero trust is a strategy, so it's basically where am I now from a zero trust maturity perspective, and what are the most important projects that's going to incrementally move me up the maturity model to enable me to actually better deliver the mission over time and the likes. Now, to that end, there's key components. I keep coming back to a key component of zero trust is automation, and a key element of what that means is continuous ATO, continuous monitoring. Now, when you look at that through the lens of, that definition, meaning actually have an automated verification of all of your security controls every day without a human having to do anything, right? That, to me, as a former CIO, if I had that when I was a CIO, I have a big S on my chest, and it would not stand for Sean. It would be super CIO, right? But today, it can be done. And actually, I can tell you now, we're doing that now for several customers. But a key element of that is when you look at, whether it be public cloud or private cloud, having all of the AC controls, and you can map those to the IL levels as well, where you have all the controls mapped to all of the services, and that map to if those services are actually running, and that rolling into a scorecard at the application level with role-based management. So I can see ACX is red, ACX is X service that's running in either public cloud or private cloud. I can also see it when you start to use services like Dynatrace and FOSSA that's actually giving you vulnerability and open source vulnerability scanning that's focused on supply chain. Now, as any updates are made, you actually have direct APIs that rolls that out into your scorecard from a compliance standpoint of your application. And now you have a red, green, yellow, pass, fail based on actual outputs on a daily basis. that's giving you your security posture, not just as I'm doing a third-party assessment once every 3 years, but it's actually saying the control level of technical controls every day for all of the services that's running in production and any new changes of that application with APIs directly feeding and giving you that insight. So now, can you get there overnight? No. every agency is at a different place in their maturity level, roadmap, or the likes. But that's the beauty in the zero trust strategy. Because now if you're saying, I want to get there, now you start to say, build that into the strategy, build a plan, work the plan, incrementally get there, take baby steps, but it can happen. Technology is there, but you got to have a strategy. And now you got to say, from a culture perspective, how much can we actually endure, right? Because you can have great plans, but the culture isn't there, and then the agency can't actually adopt it. So everybody's got to deal with it differently, but you can leverage, you can transition from old to new and massively increase your security posture. But like I said, every agency, every department is going to be a little different. I'm just kind of wondering, Nate, what's your take on that vantage point?
No, I think you're spot on, right? And we have to, everybody's got to get away from treating individual systems and applications, stop treating them as pets and start treating them like cattle, right? Getting those frameworks in place that everything goes through the same process, and you've got a level of assurance that's built through, because you've also got to maintain that speed of delivery that the mission space is asking for, right? So you can't build a cumbersome framework that requires all this all this work back and forth. And to your point, reducing the human element as much as we can and get some of that AI intelligence in there. But having a process and a framework that requires developers to check code in, it gets validated. That way, when it comes out the other end, when I have my ISSOs and my ISMs review a package for an authority to operate, I already know what it looks like, because I've already had, my team's had a chance to look at it from the very beginning. But setting that mindset to get away from, again, treating applications and systems like pets and start treating them like cattle, where they're all the same, right? You don't have to individually care and feed for a cattle, right? You feed them as a herd rather than an individual special project.
Eat more chicken. Oh.
So, Jerry, I want to bring you back into the conversation. What's your perspective on leveraging automation?
Yeah, so I think, if you think about the last element of the OMB memo for application security, it was what they called that immutable workloads. And automation is the key to those immutable workloads, right? The ability to have a sustainable process that the developer performs their, they code their feature, they check in their code, the code gets automatically tested, the developers have unit tests that they test, and it flows through the process of automation and integration. And the great thing about immutable workloads is if there's a problem, it gets rolled back, right? And so that automation really helps reduce human errors, because it's no longer the developer offline going and running some unit test on his workstation and then saying, yeah, it looks good to me. It's part of the actual build and integration process of the application. And the tests are designed beforehand to test features. And there's all kinds of things, you can integrate tools like Checkmarx into that CI/CD pipeline as well. And you can say, look, along the way, I want that code statically analyzed by a tool like Checkmarx before it even gets checked in. And then if it has an error, I'm going to send it back to the developer and they got to fix it, right? And so all of that stuff, that immutable workload and the ability to say, if there's something wrong, I can roll the application back to the previous version, is really kind of getting towards that automation and the dream of automation. And by the way, that doesn't just need to apply on the application development side. That can also be applied to the the infrastructure side. Is you can have infrastructure engineers that are also doing all their infrastructure changes as code. They call it infrastructure as code, right? And so just the same way as when you are an infrastructure engineer and you're treating anything you do to touch the infrastructure as a code check-in, that's different than going hands-on keyboard to a portal or a tool command line interface and fat fingering commands, right? So all of that automation extends not just to the developer of the application, it also extends to potentially the deployer and operator of the application.
And I think that's where you start to get in some trouble, because typically that is not an infrastructure engineer. They were doing the physical stuff. Once it gets to the IAC, that now falls squarely into the developer's role. And as consumers, we have to be aware that this technology is constantly shifting. So we have to make sure that as you're thinking about how am I acquiring this software and what policies and procedures am I putting in place, that technology shifts every day, that new things are coming out, new ways of doing things, new frameworks, new architectures. So we have to maintain ourselves, as well as our vendors have to train internally, such that when I started, I wasn't writing infrastructure as code. That stuff would show up on a loading dock. That doesn't happen anymore. It's conjured magically through code. So how are we doing with that, and how are we keeping up with that load, the mental load on those developers and those development teams, and what are the vendors doing to make sure that they're keeping up?
JR?
Yeah.
I'm
Okay.
sorry, Jerry. Go.
I'll slightly disagree, but that's okay. We can disagree. I actually don't think it's the developer's job. I think if we actually transition our IT engineers and our infrastructure engineers to DevOps practices, they should actually learn development practices and be checking in those infrastructure changes themselves.
Yeah, I won't disagree with you, but I'm saying that in modern application development, developers are often writing that infrastructure as code as well. And that's not to say that's the entire enterprise, but certainly in application delivery, that often happens. So, you should be clear on that from your provider. Who is doing that, and how are they trained, and what is their knowledge level to make sure that you're getting what you expect. If you're expecting that infrastructure people are doing it, but it's a developer because it's anybody that can check in code, then you might want to ask some more questions in that process.
So I'm going to throw one more thought into the conversation, and JR, I'm going to toss it to you first. How can agencies evaluate the reliability, compatibility, and scalability of new technologies or automation or whatever it is you're adding into your system before they adopt them? Is there a way?
Test. I mean, for sure. I mean, put these, sort of new capabilities, into the stream of what you're actually doing. Which, look, a lot of times, we only can afford to build one, but you sort of need to build two, because you have to have something that replicates, whether it's all software defined or not, what we actually do in production, so that you can actually bring these sort of new ideas in and model them and simulate how they would actually perform within the sort of production-like environment. And if you don't do that, then obviously you're going to now probably less likely to take on risk of just implementing something new. But second, you can actually just sort of see how this thing really performs and whether or not it actually delivers the value and the outcomes that I'm expecting it to do. And look, I think that's really important, because when we think about what we've done for virtual machines, back to the story of how we did a great job with networks because our networks were getting penetrated. We did a better job on our endpoints because they're getting penetrated. Now it's an applications thing, and now it's sort of an API thing. So this journey that we've been on is the same here now for application and software development. And we've got to do a better job, because as we're looking to create more microservices in order to break this down and make it quicker and easier to do, now we have to bring the testing regimes into play as well. And that will become the long pole in the tent. This will be the reason why things take longer to get out and deliver that new value, if you will, to your consumers. So it's important that we not pour it on top. It's important that we don't just have these toll gates, but we actually integrate that governance right into those running processes to ensure that as we get to that next step, it's meeting the fit for use requirements in addition to the fit for purpose requirements.
No, this is great conversation. Nate, I want to ask you, what about that? Adopting new technologies, what are your thoughts, and what's the process?
Absolutely. So anytime there's a new technology to be adopted, right, CIOs somewhere in their organization need to have a portion of the office that looks at, is this a current capability that we already have? Many organizations will buy a solution, deploy 50% of it, think that's it, and then they go off and buy another tool that can do what they already have in-house. So you can save yourself a lot of work if you go back and look at your already in-house capabilities and in-house procurements you've already got with the capabilities that are already there. But as far as new technologies and new solutions coming in, I think AI is going to be, like we talked about before, is definitely a game changer for cyber. It's going to allow us to move faster. I think, Jerry, you talked about a few items too, that it's critical to have software checked in and reviewed way before it's actually rolled out and actually finalized for production deployment. Getting to that immutable code, absolutely. But again, there's pieces of technology that we need to get in place as an infrastructure, to get to all those, great stories.
And let's not forget, though, that that Gen AI and those capabilities are not only being used by the good guys. So while we may think that it's going to make us move faster from the white hat side, the black hat side is making good use of it as well. And one of those aspects is the now malicious coders that are sitting outside and pushing in ways that is most evident in the government space. That we need to do a good job of helping the vendors understand and threat model properly for the kind of things that the government sees versus the commercial sector.
So this has been a great conversation. Pardon my interruption, but I wanted to give you all a chance we have about 5 minutes left. So I'm going to use this as a lightning round just to ask you, what does application security look like as we move into the deadlines in 2024 for application security, and over the next 5 years, what's your vision for what this will look like? What are the new and upcoming things that agencies really should be aware of? And I'll start with you, Jerry.
Yeah, so real quickly, I think it's if you think about what's in the OMB memo, there are 6 elements. I think it's you have to look at this as a journey, not a destination, right? And so agencies are going to do what they can to implement and be compliant with the requirements, but then it's also about continually maturing, continually evolving and your capabilities across those 6 areas. And so I think you'll see agencies in various states of maturity across those 6 application security elements that are called out for the Zero Trust memo. And I think it's just every agency is going to be limited by expertise, funding. A lot of us, are limited. We haven't talked about this, but a lot of us are limited by the technical debt that is across our infrastructures that I would like to be able to do this, but this is stopping me, right? And so I think you'll just see this journey happening across government agencies based on their capabilities, expertise, resourcing that will continue to improve across these areas, but there will be some minimum bars that they must meet from a compliance perspective.
Excellent. Nate, what are your thoughts?
No, I think we've already covered most of the topics I was going to go through, right? I think the advancement and the exciting times we're in now, we're in for a good ride. And, Peter, your point about, AI is not just being used by the good guys, it's being used by the bad guys. That's that perpetual cat and mouse game that we're always in that keeps, cyber exciting. But, being able to identify behavioral analytics, I think is going to be a game changer. Is it acting normal? Is it acting abnormal? Is it reaching outside of its container? What is it doing? Is it getting access to data it's never accessed? Is it doing it off hours? All these behaviors are going to be leading indicators. It's no longer going to be signature based to identify vulnerabilities going forward.
It's fascinating. Peter, what do you think? What will it look like in the next 5 years? Application security.
Yeah, I want to see a greater collaboration between consumer and vendor. So the public sector needs to be very clear about the threats that they face. So, Jerry talked about limited budget, limited time, and other technical debt limitations that you may have. Well, I think about that as a good governance function to go and threat model those, understand what they are, what can I do about it, what can I afford to do about it, prioritizing those things, and making sure that your vendors are aware of your constraints and your priorities, because you are the ones that ultimately need to decide what is good enough for you, and we as vendor need to know that through your eyes.
All right, I love this. 30 seconds, Sean, you're on.
Seize the moment, right? From a government perspective, I mean, typically you have to find the fire for you to get funding and get folks to pay attention. No need to find the fire now. The fire's here, justifications here, policies here, funding is coming. So it's an opportunity to actually move the needle, move the flag down the field from a let's say a partner or vendor perspective. Be the best partner to the government to help them exploit the opportunity that they have in front of them. Because it's not just widgets; it's help drive these outcomes.
Okay, I love it. JR, you get the final
Well,
word.
and bring the water to the fire, for crying out loud. And let's create a few fire breaks along the way too, so that we don't destroy the entire town when the fire does hit. But I'll tell you what, it's not. It's not S-bombs. So S-bombs will be there. Perhaps documentation is important to have, but the change life cycle is going to go so fast that it's going to quickly outpace, even through automation, what the S-bombs are. It's about open source, and it's about ensuring that we use open source safely and effectively. It's about zero trust. We've talked about this, and build in a zero trust architectures and elements around container and serviceless and immutability and those kinds of things. Quantum, probably a little bit in this sort of 5-year horizon, and certainly building in resiliency for quantum and use of cryptography. And I'd say probably just let's not forget the basics of the DevSecOps pipeline. And it's important that as we build software, we operate software, that we actually build those security principles directly into the source of this, and not trying to put it on the outside.
This has been, and thank you very much, JR, and all of you for your comments, one of the most fascinating conversations on this topic. I want to thank all of you for your time today. You were terrific. And audience, I'm sure you feel similarly. If you have comments or questions that you would still like to ask, we'll do our best to get them answered. Please use the tab at the top of your screen to ask those questions. Meanwhile, thanks for taking the time to listen to and watch How to Fight Threats of the Software Supply Chain. We have many more powerful topics like this one, so please go to fedinsider.com for more details about those coming up. All right, thank you all. Have a great day, and I turn it back over to Ms. Claudia Hosky, publisher of Fed Insider, to wrap things up for us today.
Thanks, Jane. And thank you again to our awesome speakers. And to our audience, thank you for your participation. Training certificates will be emailed after the webinar ends. And remember to log back in the next day or two if you want a copy of the captioning transcript. As Jane mentioned, we have many webinars in the works, so be sure to visit fedinsider.com so you can see what's coming up and register for multiple webinars at the same time. And while you're there, you can check out our podcast, Feds at the Edge. And with that, this is Fed Insider signing off.